There's a moment in certain traffic stops where everything feels slightly off, not illegal, not obvious, just off. The tone is different. The questions don't quite match the situation. The stop feels like it's going somewhere it shouldn't, but you can't quite explain why. And most people, in that moment, do what they've always been told to do. Stay quiet, be polite, don't question anything. But what happens when someone actually understands the law deeply and decides to respond differently? What happens when the person in that driver's seat isn't guessing, isn't nervous, isn't trying to get out of trouble, but instead knows exactly what's happening, step by step? Let me ask you something honestly. If a police officer started pushing the limits during a traffic stop, asking questions that didn't feel right, stretching the stop longer than necessary, would you recognize it? Or would you just go along with it? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is where the gap between knowledge and instinct becomes very real. And what you're about to hear isn't about being aggressive. It's not about winning against the police. It's about understanding the system well enough that you don't get pulled deeper into something you never intended to be part of. Now picture this. Late afternoon. Quiet road. Nothing unusual. A car is moving with the flow of traffic. No speeding, no swerving, no obvious violations. Then suddenly, flashing lights. The driver pulls over calmly, signals early, stops safely. From the outside, it looks like any normal traffic stop, but inside the car, the driver is different. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because they've spent years studying the law. Not casually, not from internet clips, but deeply. They understand how stops work, what officers can do, what they can't do, where the lines are, and where those lines sometimes get blurred. And most importantly, they know how quickly things can go wrong when you don't understand your own position. The officer approaches. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" That question again. It sounds harmless, almost routine. But the driver doesn't take the bait. Instead of guessing, instead of admitting anything, they respond calmly. "Officer, I'd prefer not to answer any questions." No attitude, no tension, just a boundary. And right there, something subtle shifts, because most drivers don't respond like that. Most drivers start explaining, "I might have been going a little fast. I didn't see the sign. I was just trying to..." But not this time. The officer pauses slightly, then continues, "License and registration." The driver complies, no hesitation, no argument. This is important, because knowing your rights doesn't mean refusing everything. It means understanding what is required and what is optional, and responding accordingly. Now the officer walks back to the patrol car, runs the information, comes back, but instead of ending the stop, the questions start expanding. "Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? How long were you there?" Now here's where most people start talking again. They feel like they need to cooperate. They think answering will make things easier. But the driver stays consistent. "Officer, I invoke my right to remain silent." Again, calm. Again, respectful. But now, something important has happened. This is no longer just a casual interaction. It's structured. Because invoking that right clearly changes what the officer can do next. They can still proceed with the reason for the stop. But continued questioning becomes limited. Now here's where things get more interesting. The officer doesn't like the lack of cooperation. The tone shifts slightly. "Step out of the vehicle." Now for most people, this is where anxiety spikes. They feel like the situation is escalating, and they react. But the driver doesn't rush. They pause, just enough to stay grounded. "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That question lands differently now, because it's not being asked out of confusion, it's being asked with awareness. The officer responds, "You're being detained." That's expected, and now the situation is clearly defined. The driver steps out, slowly, carefully, hands visible, no sudden movements, because knowing the law also means understanding safety. Now outside the vehicle, the dynamic changes. More visibility, more scrutiny. The officer circles slightly, observes. Then comes another question. Mind if I search the vehicle? This is where many people unknowingly give up one of their biggest protections. They say yes, sometimes out of nervousness, sometimes because they think refusing makes them look guilty. But the driver doesn't fall into that trap. I do not consent to any searches. Clear, direct, no explanation. Now here's the key detail most people miss. Refusing consent does not stop a search if the officer has legal grounds, but it prevents you from giving permission where none was required. And that matters later, much more than people realize. Now the officer is visibly less comfortable because the usual flow isn't working. The driver isn't talking. They're not reacting emotionally. They're not giving anything extra. And that creates a different kind of pressure, because now the officer has to rely strictly on what they can legally justify, not what they can get through conversation. Now let's pause here for a second, because this is where the misunderstanding often happens. This is not about dismantling an officer. It's not about embarrassing anyone. It's about removing uncertainty. When you know your rights, and you apply them calmly, you don't need to argue. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to prove anything in the moment. You simply stop contributing to a situation that could grow unnecessarily, and that alone changes the outcome. Now back to the stop. The officer goes back to their vehicle again. Time passes. The driver stands calmly. No pacing, no nervous movements, just stillness. Because once you've said what needs to be said, there's nothing more to add. Eventually, the officer returns. Tone slightly different now, more formal, less probing. They issue a warning, hand back the documents, and then something subtle but important happens. That'll be all. You're free to go. That's it. No dramatic ending, no confrontation, just a clean exit. But here's what actually happened beneath the surface. The stop never expanded beyond its legal boundaries because the driver didn't allow it to. Not by force, not by resistance, but by awareness. Now let's break down why this matters so much. Most people think problems during traffic stops come from what the officer does, but in reality, many problems come from what people say. They talk too much, they guess, they contradict themselves, they try to explain situations that don't need explaining. And in doing so, they create more questions, more suspicion, more reasons for the stop to continue. But when you remove that variable, when you stop feeding the situation with unnecessary information, the interaction has nowhere to go except its original purpose. And that's where control comes from. Now here's something I want you to really think about. The driver in this situation didn't win anything. They didn't outsmart the officer. They simply avoided making mistakes. And that's the real goal. Because once you're in a situation like that, you're not trying to prove you're right. You're trying to avoid making it worse. And that's a very different mindset. Now imagine the same scenario, but with a different approach. The driver starts explaining, answers every question, gets nervous, says something slightly inconsistent. Now the officer has more to work with, more reason to continue, more reason to investigate, and suddenly, a simple stop becomes something much bigger. That's how quickly things can change, not because of what was done, but because of what was said. So the next time you find yourself in that situation, lights behind you, questions coming your way, uncertainty building, you won't rely on instinct, you won't guess, you'll stay calm, you'll understand what's happening, and you'll respond in a way that keeps the situation where it belongs. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful thing you can do in a traffic stop is not give the situation a reason to grow beyond what it needs to be.